And the next debate on the agenda is situation in Ethiopia. I will give the floor to the authors first, and we start with Mr. Berg. 1 minute, please.
Herr Präsident, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, President. I think that we can all agree that the humanitarian crisis can change very quickly into a catastrophe, and I'm very concerned that the Ethiopian government has decided to ignore calls for de-escalation and is saying that this is a quick operation. But I'm not sure whether or not killing people quicker makes the policy more legitimate. In the history of Ethiopia, what we have always seen is that Ethiopians kill other Ethiopians, and for this reason, the constitution includes secession, which is very rare, and they're now violating their own constitution, and people coming of Tigray have had their weapons taken away from them, and Al-Shabaab can only benefit from that. Thank you.
Mr. Urban Crespo, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, as you know, the war in Ethiopia has triggered a major humanitarian crisis in the region. Over 40,000 refugees in Sudan, thousands of people internally displaced in a country where over 5 million people already relied on food aid. We need an immediate ceasefire. We must demand protection for civilians and support inclusive dialogue involving all parties. We need to put an end to any external interference in the conflict from Eritrea and other countries in the region. We need peace and stability in the country, and we need to do more. We need debt cancellation. We should not have humanitarian aid conditional upon migration controls. Peace and stability can only be achieved when you have full respect for economic freedoms, social freedoms, civil freedoms, and that means that we need to put an end to poverty and inequality in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Mr. Zorrinho, 2 minutes, please.
Just a year back, we congratulated the Ethiopian Prime Minister for having received the Nobel Prize for cooperation and for promotion of peace and resolving the border conflict with Eritrea. And that is why we salute this democratic effort and think that it is unfortunate that this has been undermined by the government's actions against the Tigray region. We are asking for a cessation immediate through dialogue and to put an end to the massive displacement of individuals, to make sure that we do not have a global humanitarian crisis. This is a strong appeal then to both sides so that we can promote a democratic process and to make sure that there is peace in Ethiopia. So we are calling on the federal and regional authorities to make sure that they put an end to any military mobilization and come forward with peaceful dialogue. The European Union and its member states should deploy all efforts together to assist those regional and central government authorities to protect those who are at risk and to make sure that the humanitarian efforts are bolstered. This is a time at which Europe and African relations are so important, and hence the need for parliamentary cooperation to be able to solidify our cooperation. We must use all resources necessary for the people of Ethiopia, for peace, for the territorial integrity, for tolerance, for transparency, for freedom of expression, and for the right to have a dignified life. Thank you.
Mrs. Langensiepen, 1 minute and a half, please.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren.
Ladies and gentlemen, Committee threatens aggressive comments about the civilian population that leads to new power relationships in Ethiopia and calls them. And then in addition to that, there's the threat of civil war and balkanization. And for that reason, we call on all sides to avoid escalation of the situation, to immediately introduce a ceasefire, and we're calling upon the neighbouring countries not to increase tensions. And we have to look at the current developments, and we look at attacks on ethnic and religious groups, and we see the escalation. And there needs to be an independent committee to look into all of this. The TPLF are part of the history of Africa, and we need a stronger leadership, and Europe and the EU are willing to provide assistance and help with a de-escalation, and this links to questions about our role as mediator. But Europe and the member states need to make clear that bilateral relations with Ethiopia are at stake, and much more is at stake: human rights and the protection of each and every individual. Thank you.
Mrs. Kanko, 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. The situation in Ethiopia. The situation in Ethiopia is urgent. The country's grip on peace is slipping with every passing day. Its leader, Abiy Ahmed, has a Nobel Peace Prize, but is refusing to pursue peace in his own country. I believe he should give that back. He's been a wolf in sheep's clothing, a reformer turned authoritarian. In the Tigray region, hundreds are already dead, with ethnic targeted violence and violations of human rights. Buildings and homes are shelled, and roads are blocked to humanitarian assistance. There are no telecoms, no internet or electricity, and millions face the threat of famine. In a country that once was a stabilizing factor and influence in a fragile region and a pivotal force in the fight against the spread of Islamic terrorism, tens of thousands of Ethiopians now cross the border to eastern Sudan to seek safety. Progress and development in Ethiopia was hard-won. We must do all we can to help prevent that progress from being lost forever. A looming civil war could destabilize the whole region and trigger another humanitarian crisis that could reach the shores of Europe. We must continue to call for international mediation and a ceasefire, as you have done this week, Mr. Borrell, but I would also stress that rarely does a crocodile yield to the roar of a toothless tiger. The EU provides large amounts of development assistance to Ethiopia, and we should consider using this and all available leverages to help de-escalate the conflict. Time is running out to salvage the situation and forge a path to free, fair and transparent elections and ultimately to democracy. Nothing short of our most determined and resolute effort is needed. Thank you.
Mr. Etienne, 1 minute and a half, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, we have already hundreds of civilian deaths and mass displacement of people in Eritrea. It has already been said that there are more than 40,000 people that have crossed the border to Sudan, to the southern part of Sudan, destabilizing even more the fragile situation in Sudan. These developments are going on with violences and breaches of human rights. At this moment, access for human rights workers and aids is severely restricted. Those organizations can even not go into those regions to help the people. We call on the EU and the member states to step up humanitarian aid together with the UNHCR to help those people, those most vulnerable. At the same time, we have a communication and electricity blackout, which has already been said by Ms. Kanko in the Tigray region, which is very worrying, and we call on the federal government to restore this situation, to have access to communication and electricity for the civil population in this region. We support the efforts to the mediation proposed by the African Union and call on the European Union to step up its effort to use all diplomatic means in order to have a ceasefire, in order to protect the civilians in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Mrs. Zovko, 2 minutes.
Mr. President, in his acceptance speech as laureate for the Nobel Peace Prize, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said that the war is the epitome of hell for all involved. As the youngest leader in an African country, the Prime Minister managed to make peace with its neighbouring Eritrea after one of Africa's longest-running conflicts. Unfortunately, we witnessed that the domestic tensions between the governmental forces and the TPLF have brought the weapons back in Ethiopia, and that the country is moving towards a true civil war. As the winner of the world's most renowned Peace Prize, the Prime Minister should himself reject the notion that he can resolve Ethiopia's political crisis through force. Also, the TPLF should immediately refrain from further hostilities, and together both parties should find the courage to solve their political divergences by peaceful and democratic means. 2 months ago, European Parliament adopted a report on EU security cooperation with our partners on the African continent, including the Horn of Africa. Current developments in Ethiopia, a crucial country in this region, risk to spill over to neighbouring states. The European Union should remain supportive for the efforts of its partner countries and the African Union to prevent a bigger regional conflict and advocate an inclusive dialogue to reach peace, security and stability. At the same time, humanitarian workers should have unrestricted access to all areas affected by the conflict, and the European humanitarian entities should offer their continued assistance to Ethiopian refugees in the regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we follow with speeches on behalf of political groups. We start with the EPP. Mr. Kelly, 1 minute, please.
Fears are mounting that numerous civilians who are unable to escape the fighting could be caught in the crossfire in Tigray. I, like many in this House, am deeply concerned about the risk of violence against civilians, including potential war crimes, in the fighting around Mekelle. Reports of unimaginable atrocious crimes committed against civilians for no reason other than their ethnicity is heartbreaking and needs to stop. I join the growing calls for mediation to halt the conflict that threatens to destabilise the sword of East Africa. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people have died so far, and many more forced to flee their homes. This needs to stop. Peace and dialogue must be the victor in this conflict, and the international community must do everything it can to ensure this happens. I am very pleased that the European Parliament is loud in calling for this action here this morning. The sooner it happens, the better.
Thank you. Mr. Hiber, 1 minute and a half on behalf of SND.
Thank you, President. A year ago, Europe looked to Ethiopia with hope and confidence. It was stable, striving for progress, had a booming economy, democratic consolidation, progress when it came to civilian rights, efforts to tackle corruption, free elections, freedom of press. Ethiopia made a huge contribution to the peace and reconciliation process in East Africa. These efforts were recognised. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, And his words at the award ceremony really impressed me. We want the Horn of Africa to become the Horn of Peace. We understood that our nations are not the enemies. Instead, we were victims of the common enemy called poverty. He called for equal rights and equal opportunities for all African citizens. Listening to young people in particular, now they are calling for freedom and social justice. Those words hold true today as they did a year ago. However, less than a year later, the Horn of Africa is a powder keg. We have corona, a plague of locusts, climate change, all exacerbating the broader political context. 700,000 refugees in Ethiopia, 1 million in Sudan. Those are irrefutable consequences of conflict in the region. Now we've seen an attack on civilians in Tigray, escalating violence, clamp down on civil rights and media freedom throughout the country. Time and again we see the consequences of such conflicts, how long it can take to overcome the consequences of such conflict. Our European history shows us this all too clearly as well. Therefore, it is in Europe's interest to see this conflict swiftly and peacefully resolved. Thank you.
On behalf of Renew, Mr. Goerens, 1 minute.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, President. The means that we have to bring calm to Ethiopia are limited indeed. So we are calling for reason, a ceasefire, an immediate one, tentatives to mediate, as well as setting up of monitoring are desirable outcomes. This would be a succession of reactions, but that are not necessarily original in nature. Here we have a conflict that is a domestic one. So the primary stakeholders are the authorities of that state itself. The second external state that would be organized to intervene would be the African Union, which was established for the very purpose of coming up with solutions for this type of a conflict. The EU has a toolbox that includes a number of different devices, but could have a role, but it would be a limited one. And I would like to ask the Commissioner to speak to his colleague and to the EEAS that we would like to have a debate on the subject in the Development Committee on the suspension mechanism that could be used in the case that the crisis might be protracted. Thank you.
Mr. Czarniecki, 1 minute and a half on behalf of ECR.
Panie Przewodniczący.
President, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia is a different country for us Europeans because it is the oldest Christian country in Africa and also a former colony of one of the member states of the European Union. And I think that if only for those reasons, we should have very close relations with this country. We need to have dialogue with the president of this country because our influence is in fact limited to the pressure that we can put on the Ethiopian government. And it is important to recall that the killing of civilians by military personnel is a war crime. And we also need to be pragmatic, fighting against autonomous tendencies. With what's happening in Ekela cannot mean that we see the assassination of women and children and those who are not involved in the conflict. We have to remember that Ethiopia has also already lost Eritrea and that it is very concerned about a new loss of part of its territory. Dialogue is necessary.
Vice President Castaldo, 1 minute and a half, please.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, the brutal conflict that is currently taking place in Ethiopia and has been for 3 weeks now is not coming to a solution, neither military nor diplomatic. On the contrary, what we are seeing is that tension is escalating, and that could have dramatic impacts. Now, just a few hours back, Prime Minister Abiy made announcements that could make a bloodbath possible, and that would only escalate hostilities. We can see that the conflict seems that it's going to be an existential conflict between the regional government and the central government with no pity, and the local authorities have made a call for the local populations to fight to the end against an illegitimate central government. Now, considering this and what is taking place on both sides, there is really a risk of a new war that would be characterized by brute force and brutality. Some 600,000 people who are armed, and this is an episode that could result in a war crime. This could be a humanitarian catastrophe, and we see that this country has had ethnic tension that has never been resolved, and this country is so important for the stability in the region, and that is why we need to have more involvement with dialogue between our High Representative for the Horn of Africa as well as with the African Union in Addis, and to bring an end to this conflict that would, with a resolution that would guarantee stability in this area. We must use all of our foreign and common security instruments before someone else avails of this vacuum that exists. Thank you.
Mrs. Insir, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. It is with sadness we see how the praised reformist agenda of Ethiopia is taking a serious hit. Reports of thousands of people fleeing from Tigray, hundreds of people being killed through machete massacres, along with federal planes bombing are deeply disturbing. And so is the ethnical targeted measures, hate speech and allegation of atrocities. It risks also to have a destabilizing effect on the broader region. This less than a year since Prime Minister Abiy got the Nobel Peace Prize. Nobel Peace Prize doesn't mean that one can start acting in contrary after receiving it. Both sides need to immediately end the violence and contribute to a peaceful solution. And international observers must be able to access Tigray region. It is a war crime to target civilians. Only solution forward is dialogue, including all the relevant actors. It is imperative that the country returns to the path towards a democratic and prosperous future, and the respect of human rights and are upheld, and included the rule of law is the key. Thank you.
Mr. Stefanuta, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, if you're watching this, if your people are watching this, in a multi-ethnic state, no one should be allowed to have the upper hand. Ethiopia cannot be allowed to descend into a Yugoslav-type conflict. That is not the soul of your country. Mr. Abiy, you achieved a lot. You slashed corruption. You achieved for more democratic openness. But you have no excuse for driving 4,000 people a day across the border to Sudan. No excuse for not sitting at the table of the African Union and of the United Nations and not listening to the EU, for not allowing for humanitarian aid into Tigray, for not protecting people enough so that they have to flee Addis if on their ID happens to be the wrong ethnicity. The longer blood flows, the harder it is for peace to triumph. There is a point in a war where it is easier for people to revenge than to listen. Mr. Abiy, my colleague Mrs. Zovka reminded you of what you said last year. Let's step back from this ugly place. The European Union is here to help. Let's bring back construction. Let's bring back peace.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Commissioner. Mr. Lenarčič, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, since the fighting broke out in Ethiopia's Tigray region, reports of a high number of casualties, of serious human rights and of serious international humanitarian law violations have been increasing. This is a major concern for the European Union, and we were saddened by the tragic loss of lives of Ethiopian people as a result of this conflict. The danger of a major humanitarian crisis is imminent, and an immediate de-escalation is needed. All parties should show restraint and reinforce their calls to avoid incitement to hatred and violence. As a Commissioner in charge of humanitarian affairs, I have been following closely the situation on the ground. I have been in touch with Mark Lowcock, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, with Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, with Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as with the international non-governmental organizations. In the past few days, we have already allocated initial €4 million to accommodate the most urgent humanitarian needs of Ethiopian refugees who fled the conflict to neighbouring Sudan. Sudan is already hosting a substantial number of refugees and internally displaced persons, and it is facing a considerable challenge with any new influx of people in need. I will visit Sudan next week to show solidarity with the Sudanese government that supports the Ethiopian refugees and to meet refugees themselves. As High Representative Borrell recalled at his meeting with Deputy Prime Minister Mekkonen of Ethiopia on Tuesday, the principles of international humanitarian law must be respected. In the conduct of hostilities, civilians and non-civilians have to be distinguished. Targeting civilians should be avoided at all costs by all sides. While meeting the Ethiopian Deputy Prime Minister myself yesterday, I also recalled the obligation of any party in the conflict, without distinction, to protect civilians and to ensure their safe and free movement. Furthermore, I called for full and unrestricted access for humanitarian aid and humanitarian workers to all areas affected by fighting, so that they're able to provide life-saving assistance. Honourable members, all partners of Ethiopia, and in particular its neighbours, should contribute to cessation of hostilities and to the resolution of political disputes through dialogue in the framework of the Constitution of Ethiopia. In that regard, the initiative by the African Union with the appointment of 3 high-level envoys is welcomed and supported by the European Union. Political solutions and the search for dialogue are the only viable option for the future of Ethiopia. The conflict has further increased inter-ethnic tensions, with reports of ethnically targeted measures, ethnic profiling and discrimination, hate speech and atrocities occurring. Jointly with High Representative Borrell, we expressed our deep concerns regarding these allegations. It is imperative that human rights are respected and that where abuses have occurred, they are investigated and those responsible held accountable. In conclusion, in line with the messages passed to the Deputy Prime Minister Mekkonen, we expect the Ethiopian government to show restraint and to avoid further escalation. Not to apply ethnic targeted violence or measures. This is a very sensitive issue for the European Union. We hold Prime Minister to his word that the government is making a distinction between the Tigrayan people and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. However, we have reports about blanket measures on the basis of ethnicity. Furthermore, we expect the government to allow unimpeded humanitarian access and to take all necessary measures to protect civilians, to ensure free access for media, and finally, and very importantly, to look for a political solution, a dialogue, a cessation of hostilities without delay. We encourage them to work with the African Union high-level envoys in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The debate is closed. The vote will be held today. The next